Sasquatch, Ghost, Dogman, aliens, demons, shadow people, skinwalkers, even the Fae. Our universe is vast, dark, and wrought with infinite unexplained phenomena. We have tasked ourselves with assisting humanity in finding the keys to unlock the mysteries that abound in and around our world. What we intend to reveal behind the curtain of darkness may very well invoke those fears long tucked away in our memories. We will meet that fear head on as we strive to shine the light of understanding on these phenomena. The goal is to arm you with the power of knowledge to confront and even combat these entities. We welcome you to join us on our quest. We are Midwest Night Watchers.
Hi, everybody.
Welcome everyone. Hi, everyone. Welcome tonight.
Glad y'all can join us. And we have a special guest tonight. Is going to be Paul Blake Smith, an author, and he's not very far from us, but in another state, and they're in Missouri, and they had an incident there, as you could see from our thumbnail, about a crash that happened from a UFO. And he's got a book out, several books on the incident, and he's got a new release coming out with some new information. So hopefully we'll be able to get into some of the new information that he has. I don't know how much he wants to talk about the new stuff in his book, but we'll definitely be asking questions. So if you have questions, put them in all caps for us, and we'll try to bring them up and during the show and see if he can answer some of your questions. So we'll go ahead and bring Paul up and get this show going.
Hey.
Hi.
Hi, Paul.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me on. My pleasure.
So as I was telling everybody, we're going to be talking about the Cape Girardeau incident.
Yeah, that occurred when my father was like 5.5, almost 6 years old. And my grandfather was a judge in town in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, which is, for those not familiar, a somewhat small town, about 20,000 people on the banks of the Mississippi River back then. It was a very Christian conservative community. In doing research for my book, I found that one of the top practically pastimes for people in Cape Girardeau in those days was to go to church, and then they'd tally up like a box score in a newspaper which church in town had the most people attending. You don't see that kind of enthusiasm these days. But that is a kind of a key factor here, because a lot of the story was from a Christian minister who was called to the scene of this strange crash in a farm field outside of town in late April 1941.
Wow.
Before Roswell.
Right. And so that's how a lot of this story got started, and I'll get into that. But in a second, my stepmom went to high school in Cape Girardeau in the 1960s, and she said she heard the story then, regardless of any Christian pastor, that she remembers hearing this tale of a spaceship crashing. The story kind of went viral in the late 90s, around the year 2000, and that's when I first began to hear of it. And I would hear it on Art Bell's Coast to Coast AM with Linda Moulton Howe, and it was investigated by Stanton Friedman, very famous ufologist who's now passed away, and Ryan Wood, and a private detective came to town in Cape Girardeau, and they all looked into this, and they think there's something to it. That is a very substantial story. And I kept waiting and waiting. Where is a book on this subject? And so I finally got tired of waiting. And around 2010 or so, I thought, I'm a writer. I'm from Cape Girardeau. Duh, a light goes on. Why don't I write the book? So I researched it for a number of years. And my first one came out in 2016 and did pretty well, but I did make some mistakes. I'm the first to tell you. And so in 2020, you see it on the screen, a part of your artwork. I issued a revised edition, and I've got even more information since then. So I have a new book that's supposed to come out. It's called Mo 41, Your Complete Guide to the Missouri 1941 UFO Crash. There seems to be a little snafu with my publisher, but hopefully this will come out in hardback sometime this fall. I wish I could give you more details on how you can get it and exactly what time, but the publisher's had a little health problem and we're trying to get that ironed out. So I can tell you that I haven't got shocking, earth-shaking new hard proof, but I do have some interesting stories that add up that no one's ever found before. And it clues together kind of before the case of Roswell, which was 6 years later out in the New Mexico desert. And that's why I named my first book, Mo 41, The Bombshell Before Roswell. This should have been the biggest bombshell story, but it got squashed that night and thereafter when the military came in and said, you will not write about this, you will not publish this. We'll take all those photographs you've taken here at the scene of the crash. Or it got squelched. And we are still piecing it together to this day.
Now, has anybody ever approached you while writing this book and tell you about not publishing anything?
No, I've never been warned or threatened or anything like that. I have talked to a few people who said that there have been federal agents in Southeast Missouri asking questions about the crash and who knows what. A friend of mine from high school, I was really shocked by this, around the year 2001, 2002, when Dr. Stanton Friedman and Ryan Wood came to Cape Girardeau to do research for a documentary film. My friend from high school, unbeknownst to me, contacted them and said, I can be your guide around Cape Girardeau. I'm quite fascinated, and I've been reading about this and UFOs in general. And although they turned him down, felt that it wasn't necessary for him to be a guide, he went to the library and was getting some more books, some of them on UFOs. And the librarian said, oh, there were two men in suits in here asking all about you the other day.
Oh.
Dum-dum-dum. Oh. They wanted to know, what have you been checking out? What have you been reading? You know, what are you researching? And so I guess the librarian told them, and it's a little spooky, but that was over 20 years ago. And the times have changed where so many UFO stories are going viral. They're all over the internet, videos being taken, you know, by folks with their cell phones. And there's such a flood of this on the Travel Channel, the History Channel, even National Geographic Channel. Now there's so many UFO stories, and it's being dug into, and also by Congress, the Pentagon, and people are speaking up more, that I think the government's kind of given up on trying to keep the lid on a lot of stuff. That it's like an avalanche. There's too much to try to, and I think there have been a number of other crash cases and maybe some landings and such, and they've just got too much to do. We've got a nation with too many problems to worry about shutting up somebody who saw a spaceship come down and land, and where their grandparents were part of the Cape Girardeau story back in 41, which was before World War II. Just to give you the setting, the nation, we were very worried about Hitler in Germany, and that we're kind of going to be dragged into the European conflict, whether we like it or not. And so that was our main concern. And that turned around in December of that year when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and we had to declare war on Japan first, and then Hitler came a little bit later. But in doing a lot of research and reading newspapers and magazine articles, that was the main focus, that American government was deeply worried about staying out of the European war and trying to do our best to help the British and the French stop the Nazi invasion of Europe.
Yeah, I know we were worried about, they had like they were into the spirituality, you know, the Germans, and trying, and the bell, they were worried about, they had some kind of UFO or time travel, so they were worried about that. So that would come right along with your incident in Roswell, do they have that technology? They were kind of worried about that.
One thing that I was looking up recently dovetailed perfectly with this David Grush, this member of the American government who came forward as a whistleblower in congressional hearings. And he said that it was our information that Mussolini and the Italians got a hold of a crashed disc in the early 1930s. And that it's not a joke, and there's little bits and pieces you can put together on that story. And since it's not Cape Girardeau, I didn't dive into it too much. But incredibly, about a month or two before the Cape Girardeau crash, Mussolini was warning America, you should be more worried about people from other worlds coming to your country. He didn't use the word aliens. He was quoted in a newspaper article. And sure enough, the Cape Girardeau crash happened. And that had to have been a bit of a shock to anyone in the American government who was aware that the Italians had already captured a disc, and that the Pope at the time was informed of it.
Wow. Talk about good timing, huh?
Yeah, it sure was. And it makes you think, did he know something? Did the aliens tell Mussolini that they're going to be buzzing around America? They wouldn't have known about a crash, of course, but of all the things for Mussolini to say and to be reported in the American newspapers, a crashed disc, an alien disc, he didn't know it was going to crash. So that's the setting of 41. And I'll point out something else. So we had a lot of German farmers in the Cape Girardeau countryside, a lot of German residents. And in those days, you couldn't be entirely sure, I bet 90% were pro-American, happy with America. But there was such a thing called Bundists who were pro-Nazi. And there was so much spying, espionage, and some sabotage in the Cape Girardeau area that the FBI opened up a field office in March of 41, less than 2 months before the crash. And so this was a factor in hushing it up at the time. We had so many German farmers that when the crash happened on a farm, everyone was sworn to secrecy, as we'll get to and talk about. But now it makes more sense. We even had a Lutheran church in Cape Girardeau that conducted services in German. There were so many German people.
Wow.
So, this is why they were sworn, don't talk about this. We don't want this getting back from any pro-Hitler forces in the Cape Girardeau area and sending it back to the Nazis. We wanted to have a kind of secret weapon, if you will, and to investigate, explore, and hopefully maybe exploit, because they felt World War II was inevitable at that point, but we had not joined yet. It would have been a matter of national defense to maybe scrutinize it, turn it into a modern jet plane or a weapon of some kind to weaponize it. So that's another factor. And the FBI was supposedly there, according to this Cape Girardeau minister. He said he was called that night in late April, and that he put on his hat and coat, left the house, and was driven by a man associated with the Cape Girardeau Police Department in an unmarked car. And they went about 12 or 13 miles outside of town. And the pastor was a good man. I researched him, and he's well thought of to this day. Conducted 75 baptisms in his short time in Cape Girardeau. That's impressive. And he was not a drinker or, a man prone to hallucinations or making up stories. In fact, probably just the opposite. He had to be careful to keep his job, and not be thought of as crazy. So he really clammed up. He told the story of what happened that night to his family when he got home. Must have been getting close to midnight. And he said, I'm going to tell you this story, and then I'm never going to speak of it again. And according to his family, that's just what happened. He never talked about it again. He was that spooked. They swore him to secrecy. When he came home, they said, what happened to you? Where have you been? And maybe he was a little ashen-faced or haggard or something. It was a shocking experience. And so I'm going to tell you this, where I've been, and then I'm not going to talk about it, and you're not going to talk about it. So he said that once they were called and went out to this crash, they were pretty sure this was going to be an airplane. That was their main concern, because it was after dark, and Cape Girardeau had 2 airfields, neither of which are lit, and they're pretty much closed as soon as it gets dark. So they thought that a crash, a fireball on a farm, that this must surely have been a plane that overshot the airport in the dark and produced a terrible accident. And so people went rushing to the scene. I'm sure doctors and nurses were called from the hospital. The county sheriff was there, police, a couple of military figures, and at least men in military uniform were there, according to the minister. And there were farmers, the people that came out and were gathered around in astonishment because there was no cylindrical airplane, no struts or ruts or wheels, no wings, no propellers, no exhaust. It was a circular disc that had crashed and cracked open. And the pastor said at one point, I went up to it and I took a good look in there, and he said he could see a couple tiny little seats like for children, and gauges and dials on a kind of dashboard or flight deck. And he said above that was a circular band with strange hieroglyphic type writings in it, symbols that he couldn't make out.
Oh, and wow.
So, yeah, he got a good look. I'm sure there were flashlights and lanterns, and there was a blaze going on. He said the Cape Girardeau Fire Department was out there fighting this fire in the farm field, and it set fire to it. Now, when this story broke around 2000, 2001, a Cape Girardeau fireman who was ill with cancer gathered his family around him and said, this story, this minister going out to a UFO crash in town, I want to tell you that the whole thing is true. He says, I ought to know, I was there. And I was fighting the fire. And these people came out and looked at the bodies. I saw bodies. I saw the disc. And that the military came in and told us to put everything down and get away from the crash. He said, they caught me trying to stick a little piece of souvenir in my pocket. Defying their orders. They said, no souvenirs, no debris, put that debris down. And he defied orders and he got chewed out. They took that sample back and they cussed him out and kicked him out of the crash site, told him to go home. And he said, in the aftermath, I felt sure that I was being watched around town to see if I would take any acts of retribution. And my phone was tapped. And if you, you learn that I did, to my surprise, the FBI was crazy about wiretapping people. They had a book that was so thick on the number of people they were wiretapping that they had to start a new book in 1941. And that FDR loved to wiretap people, including his own political enemies and the press. There were loose laws about wiretapping, and the FBI was able to just skirt right around it. And it's pretty outrageous that you would maybe go into someone's home or bug their phone line up on the telephone pole or something like that. So the fireman's story does make sense. And he said the whole thing is true. And so again and again, I find bits and pieces and witnesses or relatives of witnesses from then, everyone's dead and gone by now, who said this really happened. It's not a joke. And I think it really did too, that we had maybe America's first UFO crash just outside my hometown. I spoke to one woman who said, my grandparents and my mom used to talk about this matter of fact. They lived on a small farm just south of the crash area. And they said, they talked about that. Why didn't I pay more attention when I was a kid? If only I'd listened more. But I do remember they would speak, that there was a spaceship crash, and they called it Little Men. And I talked to one older woman who said, yes, I was 11 years old. And I remember that. The adults would gather and talk excitedly about these little spacemen and their little spaceship. And she said, it wasn't a joke. This woman who told me this has now passed on. And that's the problem. 1941 is 82 years ago, and everyone's gone. I mean, you had to have been a small child, and you probably wouldn't have known what's going on. So in many cases in my research, even the children of those around in 1941 are passed on. And the story gets more and more lost. Many were sworn to secrecy and threatened maybe. You don't talk about this. This is a matter of national security. This never happened, and you didn't want to be disloyal. You were very patriotic in those days. You did what the government told you. We didn't have protesters and rebels and people who would go forward if they'd been lectured like that by your own government. You would have been afraid. So that's another reason why the story just got crushed over the years. The war broke out. And then after the war, the Roswell crash happened. And that kind of got crushed for about 4 decades until the late 1980s when it started to become more exposed. Cape Girardeau just seems to be the ugly stepchild that just gets ignored, and that's not fair.
Yeah.
We haven't had a museum open or a bus tour. There's no official crash site that you can go to. It's out on a farm, and if I knew exactly where it was, I have a general location. I'm not going to tell you because I don't want to get sued. Can you imagine everyone from around the country, maybe around the world, showing up? Let's see that spaceship crash. I know you're hiding it, or let me see that debris, or let me dig in your yard. You know, this is someone's farm. It's their home and their business. And we can't have people trampling your crop and everything you work hard to try to grow, looking for some spaceship that long ago was taken away. So I've also been told a number of times, you go walking around out in the country out there, you better be wearing some thick boots, partner, because there's copperheads and rattlesnakes, and they feed on mice and rats and chipmunks and squirrels, and they get pretty big. And so that was enough to keep me out of a weedy field or a farm field. I ain't going out there. I think the best time to poke around, if you have to, would be in wintertime when the weeds are down and the crops are all harvested and gone, and the leaves are off the trees and you can see better. But still, it's private property, and you should really respect that if you go to Cape Girardeau and not go trespassing on someone's property.
Now, in your investigation in this incident, did you ever figure out or hear of exactly how big this craft was? Because you keep saying little men, little seats. So.
Right. That's a good question. It's a valid question. And I wondered too, but we can use a little logic. The minister and the fireman and the little bits and pieces of the story you can piece together, as I did in my new book, all just say it was a spaceship that crashed. They never said, oh, this thing was huge. Or they never say, oh, it's just a tiny little thing, like, you know. So I guess it would have been the size of a length of maybe a van, like a commercial van or something, only round in circumference, not elongated. And so we can just surmise logically that it was not a huge thing, nor was it a tiny little toy joke of a thing either, but that the creatures who were in it did not survive their environment, that they had like protected air and air pressure and everything. And once that disc cracked open, they were goners. And the minister who said he was called to the scene said they asked me to say prayers. I'm sure they were expecting grieving families showing up and broken bodies, human beings in states of great pain and misery and needing medical urgent care, but also needing spiritual comfort. Because again, Cape Girardeau is a very Christian community, a lot of Bible readers and such. So they naturally called this pastor to offer any spiritual comfort and to say some prayers. So he said there weren't any human bodies on the ground. He said there were 3 small, dead, gray creatures, sort of silvery gray skin or flight suits, crinkly, and big bulbous heads, big black eyes, just creepy like a doll's eyes, 2 little dots for nostrils, a little slit for a mouth, and apparently no ears. They were not human, not of this world. And, you know, back in those days, no one was prepared for this. You didn't sit around watching a TV show, My Favorite Martian or Mork from Ork or something like this, or a spaceship movie, or extraterrestrials were not in vogue. So this had to have been quite a jolt to the system for anyone showing up like, oh my God. And it would have been natural for any Christian pastor to wonder, at least at first, are these demons? Are these sent straight from hell? What is this?
Right.
So he said his prayers, and he said the 2 that were on their backs were dead. They were motionless. They were clearly pulled out of the crash and laid out on their backs. A third one nearby was barely breathing. His chest was going up and down, and he expired as the minister knelt and said some prayers. So that he said he never touched them, made sure not to get too close, but as he was standing up, two local people, civilians, picked up one of the aliens under the arms and said, "Hey, take our picture," like they got a prize pig at the fair or something. So a man who was there with a big speed graphic type news camera, like with the big flash, would go off like you see in the movies or an old documentary. He put that aside and he pulled out a little box brownie type camera, and he posed these men and they held up the alien and he snapped one picture and walked away. Now in Cape Girardeau, there was a photographer known as One Shot Frony. He was infamous in town for taking one picture to save film and walking away. When my mom was in college in the 1950s, she encountered this man, and she was with her college group, and he said, "Okay, pose, everybody hold still," took one picture and walked away. One Shot Frony was Garland Fronebarger, who was distantly related to me in the most roundabout way. He grew up with my uncle Carl Fronebarger. They were cousins. And one day in the Smith family home, Garland Fronebarger was there and recommended to my aunt, who was a little girl at the time, you need to get yourself a brownie box camera. They fit, real easy in your pocket. And I thought, cha-ching, that's another indication. This was the man, because we didn't have too many photographer newsmen back in the day in Cape Girardeau on the Southeast Missourian newspaper. So I contacted Garland Fronebarger's son, who said, he did not talk about that incident with me, but he said he was secretive about some things and very open about others. So it could have happened, and he could have taken that photograph and walked away. It sounds like something he would do, but we don't know. Even the son doesn't know. So I wrote to the people who have the Garland Fronebarger home from 1941. And I said, you want to check your attic, your crawl spaces, your basement, see if there's any film, any pictures left hidden away? And I never got a response. That would be quite a prize catch. And that leads us, to another aspect of the story. The minister told his family, or the minister's wife actually, said that 2 weeks after the crash, the photographer showed up with this picture that he had taken of the alien being held up under the arms. And he says, I have a copy of this, and I want you to have a copy, because he knew he was there, recognized each other. They were both Baptist Christians who enjoyed raising roses. That was their hobby for both of them. So that the photograph was handed over to the family of William Guy Huffman Sr. and his son, William Guy Huffman Jr. Nice folks. And they moved away from Cape Girardeau about 2 or 3 years later to a place in Oklahoma. And when they were living in Kansas in the early 50s, a man came over next door and said, that's an interesting photograph. I happen to know something about photography, and I got a friend who knows about zoology. Why don't I just take this picture and I'll get it back to you? Guess who disappeared from town within a week? He just took off completely, took the photo, and that was it. Gone. There goes the proof.
Wow.
And it's so frustrating. The whole case is frustrating. But another aspect is that people come to me all the time and show hosts and say, I know, I've seen that picture online. And what you're looking at is a recreation for a sci-fi channel show called The Secret, Evidence That We're Not Alone. It ran around 2002 or 3. And it's an excellent recreation, but it's of a man taking a picture of the alien. But that's just a recreation, well done for this documentary. The actual photograph has not surfaced. And boy, what a prize would that be? How many copies did this photographer make? You would say, if he gave one to the minister, who else could he have given one to? But so far, it's been completely squelched. So much of the story has, and it has not surfaced. And boy, that would be quite a prize to have an actual snapshot, even if it's a copy of an alien being such as it was.
I'll pop that thumbnail up real quick over top of it so people can look at it if they didn't get to see the thumbnail.
Yeah, now I've got some art, and you see that artwork right there. And that's modern computer rendering from an artist who's passed away, and I was given permission to put that on the cover of my book. That's a recreation of a man taking the picture of the alien in his little flight suit. I think the flight suit may be a little dark compared to the description of a silver, crinkly silver flight suit. But I said that's a pretty good depiction. They held him under the arms and stretched his arms out. Two men. You see a pretty good sized crash disk that may be about the size, with a fire going on in the background. The artist, I forget his name, shamefully, did a good job there in recreating it. And so I hope to have that on the cover of my new book.
Now, did anybody ever get sick from the fumes from the fire?
Yeah, that's a good question. Did you touch the aliens and get bacteria? Did you touch the craft? And I would check the newspaper for days after what I feel is the crash, and I did not really find anything unusual. They were more concerned with births and deaths, and a lot of society news in the newspaper in those days. Such and such person had guests from out of town. Such and such person went out of town, and various bigwigs. But I found a very interesting article from April 25th. That's a Friday in the Missourian that's been overlooked. And I think this has a real impact on finding an exact crash date for this event. And now, before I go into that, I have to backtrack. The Roswell crash, by all accounts, was scooped up by the Army Air Force in 1947, and they had a disc, maybe two. Rumors had that the two discs collided, and there were bodies and debris, and everything had to be stuck in a big jumbo, like DC-3 or I guess a B-52 bomber is what they were. They were bomber airplanes. That was about the biggest thing we had, and they were used to big payloads, and so it would have been natural to do that. And according to all stories, that debris recovery was taken to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, the site of so many UFO rumors and of crash debris examination and reverse engineering over the past 70, 80 years. So we know that a bomber plane was used then. In the Cape Girardeau newspaper, April 25th, there's a story from this morning. A big Air Force bomber plane circled over and over Cape Girardeau, and people were all looking up like, what's going on? Are we going to be bombed by our own Air Force? And they said the plane circled between 8:30 and 9 a.m. And then it took off. And so this is most unusual. What were they doing? It sounds like the Air Corps was looking for any other wrecks, any debris, shrapnel, bodies, anything suspicious, and they took off. They may have known that the debris had been taken to Sikeston, Missouri, and that's the site of an aerial training program that had people associated with the Air Corps. And they're the ones that are rumored to have gone to the crash site, hemmed it in, forced everyone to give over their debris, and then gathered up the goodies and took it back to Sikeston about 30 miles down the road. Now, according to a very fine reporter named Linda Wallace, whose father was part of that 1941 aerial training program, there were two different stories she gathered of a big, giant airplane landing at their aerial training program mysteriously one day that dwarfed all the little one-seater and two-seater airplanes that they trained young pilots. And it was very strange. They said armed guards came out and surrounded this jumbo plane to keep everyone away. Gee, what could that have been all about now? There was a plane matching that description over Cape Girardeau. They must have flown just south and picked up all the debris and the crashed bodies and the disc and took it out of there, what we can assume to maybe immediately to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. How can we assume that? A week later, I looked in the papers in Cape Girardeau, and there's a story of a man who came to town and said, well, I can explain that aerial event, that bomber plane overhead. That was my plane from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. What a coincidence. And he said, we were just on a simple training exercise, and we decided to fly all the way from, Wright-Patterson to Cape Girardeau and circle around and go home. That was his lame story. Yeah, a super expensive plane, super expensive fuel, like a 3-hour flight from Ohio. You circled around Cape Girardeau at the time of a spaceship crash, and then you went home. It was all very innocent.
Yeah.
So if we look at it and backtrack, then we can pinpoint the night of April 24th, 1941, as probably a Thursday night as when this could have happened. That's my best guess now. The plane would have come out if it took like 3 hours to fly from Wright-Patterson. They would have had to been notified and got up at the crack of dawn, like at 6 a.m. to get there by 8:30 and circle around and take off. So that had to have been a direct order. Who does a training exercise, while it's still dark out, we need you to get up to Cape Girardeau, Missouri, and circle around and go home. It's all very innocent. So, this story is hokum, the official story. And the newspaper probably didn't realize at the time this was connected to this crash they were not allowed to write about. So they did write about this mysterious bomber plane overhead. So that's part of my new book. And the pilots who flew it, and some other little tidbits in there on that saga. I got to backtrack again. The minister's granddaughter, William G. Huffman's granddaughter, Charlotte Huffman, her married name is Charlotte Mann, said that we feel in the family that the crash happened about a week or a little more from the birth of my older sister on May 3rd, 1941. So you put it together, April 25th, that's just a little over a week, and it does fit the timeline. Everything comes together nicely.
Wow.
And one more thing, in the Cape Girardeau papers, there's an article, a couple articles on President Roosevelt holds a press conference Friday morning, April 25th, at the same time almost that this airplane circling over town. I guess it was like a couple hours later at most, that FDR said he was most concerned about hemispheric defense. And he's talking about the defense in our airspace and defending American property and everything. And even the writer of the article at the time in 1941 kind of pointed out, well, this is unusual. Why was the president repeating this at this press conference? Well, it makes more sense now. If he had been called and notified that, that we have this disc from another world, and who knows if there's going to be more or not. It was probably not something that sent a panic through the brass, but they obviously wanted to know what's going on. Are there other discs being seen? Other craft? Are we about to be invaded? Was this a scouting mission by an invading force from Mars or something? So the president would have naturally have been notified of this stunning event. And as it turns out, he knew about Cape Girardeau because he's been there. He arrived in Cape Girardeau in 1920. He was campaigning for the vice presidency. In those days, he was healthy and could walk. And he and Eleanor had been in Cape Girardeau, arrived by train, and spoke downtown at a courthouse where my grandfather later worked as a lawyer and as a judge. And so FDR probably lit up that night. Cape Girardeau, oh yeah, I remember being there. Nice town, I'm sure he said. So he had to have been issuing orders to scoop up that stuff and get it out of there so that our top scientists can study it. And I think it was eventually taken to Washington, D.C., so that it could be studied by our top brass there. And I'm sure he wanted to look at it too. Wouldn't you?
Right.
Yeah.
You have to know what you're dealing with as president. You need all the latest information. So he was bound by his wheelchair, his childhood polio, that he had a very substantial disability that most Americans didn't even know about, which is stunning today. It was kept secret from Americans. He would stand up and brace himself on a person on either side or hold on to a railing and pretend like he could walk or was able to stand, and it was very painful for him. But that just goes to show you the level of secrecy and how easily cold hard facts were kept from the American public in those days. You didn't talk back and start trouble and expose things in that era. So that's how, again, the Cape Girardeau story could have been covered up, maybe under direct orders of President Roosevelt.
Wow.
Wow.
Now, was there a lot of military presence? I mean, you talk about the plane. It obviously came in to take the craft away, but how did they transport it to the airport, or was there military there to recover it?
Yeah. I'm sure the trucks that came up from Sykeston put all the debris in it. And according to one story that Linda Wallace, very fine reporter, put together, a flatbed truck was pulled to the site. And they thought, this thing's going to be heavy. We better enlist some muscular men to help us. And they found out to their shock that it was light as a feather. This metallic craft from another world was so advanced that they didn't need a muscle-bound guy to help them. The military put it on this flatbed and hauled it out of there. I'm sure they got plenty of it that night. And then the next morning in the light of day, where you could see everything a lot better, they began picking up all the tiny pieces, and they got those bodies out of there. They would have been a real life freak show for people to show up. I want to see those big-headed aliens, you know. I would have wanted to see it. There wasn't anything else to do in that town in those days. I'm sure people showed up just because they thought maybe an airplane crash. That's somewhere to go and something to see. We heard there was a fire without even knowing that it was otherworldly. So they had to keep the site clear, tell everyone to beat it, and pick up all the debris and take it to Sykeston, where I think that bomber plane landed. We can logically speculate, and then took it out to Ohio and maybe even Washington, D.C. And there's still more juicy stories about that.
Now, did they hire a local truck, or was it a military truck?
I would imagine that it was a military truck, but when you're talking a big flatbed, that's a good question. That might have been like a civilian truck from a early kind of trucking industry, you know, type of facility. I don't know. An aerial training program in Sykeston would have had access to a flatbed rig like that. When you follow orders and they show up, you know, these military guys with guns, and they probably commandeered it and said, we're taking this truck, give us the keys, you know, important mission, just keep your mouth shut. That's probably what happened. And so they hauled it away. And there were a number of rumors about the Sykeston Air Corps and what they had hidden away for a little while in those days, and how people over the next months and years died mysterious deaths, according to Linda Wallace's research. Suicides that were most suspicious, that some people may have been knocked off because they knew the truth. They'd seen the bodies and the craft, and it's very shady. I wish I knew of stories like that in Cape Girardeau, but again, they may not have been allowed to be printed. But the bits and pieces all hang together logically, and I think we can take this story very, very seriously. And when this David Grush testified this summer before Congress, he said there have been crashes, a number of crashes with bodies recovered, and they've been scrutinized along with the metal and the craft. And I'm thinking, bingo, Cape Girardeau, because he didn't say, oh, it was just Roswell. He said there have been crashes. So, and he did point out something like since the 1930s. So, you know, that encompasses the time. It'll fit together. We need more whistleblowers to come forward. We need more evidence, like someone's got an old diary. Someone's got something they found in their attic, film footage or a photograph or a letter that, you know, describes it. I'm still optimistic. People send me little tips every now and then over Facebook or social media. I'm always happy to get an email from someone who's not fooling around or making stuff up. They also want an answer to this mystery. And so there's lots of little side stories. I can tell you that there is another minister who had daughters involved in seeing the crash remains, evidently, in Washington, D.C. Reverend Turner Holt, according to his own daughters, who were getting quite elderly at the time, but they wanted to get this story out, and they told it on camera a couple of times. He was a cousin to Secretary of State Cordell Hull, who worked for FDR. Reverend Turner Holt said he went to Washington one day in the early 40s, and Secretary Hull said, I want to show you something. First, let me swear you to secrecy that you'll never talk about this. And he did on the steps of the U.S. Capitol building. So they went in after the oath and went down story after story. Must have been like 6 or 7 stories down below. And it turns out the U.S. Capitol building has many stories down below the surface. They're used as storerooms. And so he said, we were taken, Hull took me to this storeroom, opened a door, and there was this disc that had been cut up into pieces. It was a metallic ship from another world. 3 dead bodies in 3 glass jars. These creepy little gray aliens, they were floating around in what they thought was probably formaldehyde to preserve them, like they were scientific specimens from a lab or something that they'd gotten a hold of. And he said there was like a box or 2 of shrapnel, debris, and everything matches this Cape Girardeau story. So when you think about it, if the president is handicapped and other members of Congress are interested, boy, we'd like to see this. Where would you take it in 1941? There was no CIA. There was no Pentagon. You wanted to have access to it, but you wanted it well guarded. There were Washington, D.C. police, Capitol police that patrolled the Capitol building. And there were military officers in and out of the Capitol. It would have been very, very well guarded. So they did what they thought was right. And they seem to have stuck the debris and the recovery finds in this storeroom, at least for a while, probably thinking, until the heat dies down, we got to keep our eyes peeled for anything else and keep this well guarded, not just from the American people, but from aliens in case they come back and say, we want our stuff back. Our brother died. We want those bodies back. So I doubt if they ever did so. But I got a call a couple of years ago from an old man. He said, my father worked for the Roosevelt administration in the Bureau of Statistics. And one day, he said, in the early 40s, on the last day of school, I went to visit him. And we went under the Capitol. We took that little train. There's like a subway train even back then. And my dad led me to this several stories down below the Capitol, and we opened this storeroom and turned on this yellow light bulb, he said, in the room. And sure enough, 3 dead bodies, 3 glass jars, spaceship, debris. And he said his dad didn't make any comment, just said, oh, well, this looks like some sort of storeroom. And then they said, time to go. And they turned off the light and shut the door. But he wanted to confirm that I saw this. And it does confirm that, again, this would have been a logical place. And here's another story. FDR, Vice President Henry Wallace, and many, many members of the Roosevelt administration were Freemasons. And Freemasons revere, above all buildings, the Capitol building. And they have it on the cover of their literature, the Freemasons. And they show the Capitol building that they apparently helped design and use for Masonic members, maybe even have meetings there. Harry Truman was the Grand Master Mason of Cape Girardeau, or of all Missouri, and in 1941. You can't make this stuff up. And I found out and put in my new book, Harry Truman was around the site of the crash, I feel, 5 months before it happened. He just got reelected in November 1940, and it was his job as Grand Master Mason to go around the state to all the Masonic lodges. So he went to this small town near Cape Girardeau and drove near their airfield because we were having a controversy over getting the funds from Congress to turn it into a full-fledged airport with lights and everything. So he was right there in that area 5 months before the crash. Then he went to Cape Girardeau and gave this big Masonic dinner and gave a speech. And he even wrote a letter that's available to this day and signed it Harry Truman in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, November 1940. So of all the places he could have been, and when they told him the story, maybe days or weeks after the crash, probably a light went on in his head. Ka-ching, I remember that. I was practically there 5 months ago.
Yeah.
So of all the strange stories, Harry Truman even lived in Cape Girardeau in the summer of 1906. He was in the Army training at our armory we had in town, and he was eventually trained so well he served in World War I in Europe. But in those days, he was a young cadet, and he was trained at the Cape Girardeau Armory. He came over from like Independence on the other side of the state. So he made friends with, of all people, Garland Fronebarger, one-shot Frony. He was friends with that guy. The coincidences and the connections are all just really weird. Truman must have been told at some point because A, he was the senator from Missouri, B, he knew all about Cape Girardeau and knew people there, and C, he was this high-ranking Freemason Grand Master. And he would have been a logical person to put on the ticket. Even though Wallace was the vice president, Wallace pretty much got kicked off the ticket, and for some mysterious reason, Roosevelt wanted Harry Truman on the ticket as his vice president in 1944. And of course, the rest is history. Harry took over shortly thereafter and won a term on his own. And you know what? Research shows that the mayor of Cape Girardeau was a Freemason who got access to Harry in Chicago, in Washington, and in Southeast Missouri when President Truman was here. Gee, I wonder what they were talking about behind closed doors that they couldn't discuss, you know. So again and again and again, the story is so fascinating and it holds together, but it's so tough to get rock solid proof like a released leaked document or a photo that we know is authentic or an actual piece of debris, although there's an interesting rumor on that too.
Oh.
Yeah, I wonder how many people had access to that closet, you know, inside the Capitol.
Yeah, I suppose if you were in the know and it was approved that you got in there, but that'll remain a mystery. But if other people knew, they sure kept their mouths shut. You know, they didn't tell that story. Reverend Turner Holt said, I saw this. His cousin Cordell showed it to him. And Holt said, these are people from another world. We don't know much about it. So that Holt and Holt left the Capitol, and Holt went home, and he tried to tell his daughters about it. One was sort of interested, and the other not really interested at all. But as older women, they recalled this, that their father told us, and he was not the type to lie. He was a good-hearted Baptist minister, just like Reverend Huffman in Cape Girardeau, good man. So the pieces, we can follow a little trail. Now, when I was doing research for my first book, I would go to the Topics Online forum, and a discussion in Cape Girardeau. One of the little subjects on the side was the 1941 UFO crash. And there were clues to this crash. And one man said, my grandparents owned and farmed the land where the crash occurred. They told me only a little bit about it, but they are afraid to tell me more. So as an adult, he gathered up his money and his free time, and he flew to Cape Girardeau, he said, to look into this. He found the farm and found the man who had bought the farm from his grandparents after World War II. The man said, I don't know about any spaceship crash. No one told me that. But I can tell you, I was digging in the dirt, and I found these strange shards of metal with strange imprints like hieroglyphics or strange symbols. I couldn't make heads or tails of it, he said. And he couldn't cut it with very sharp cutting instruments on the farm. And he couldn't bend or crease them permanently. Boy, this sounds familiar, doesn't it? Sounds like Roswell. Well, the man said, I gathered all this stuff and kept it in a container in my barn. And the gentleman who was interviewing said, I couldn't get the old man to tell me what he had done with it. But he claims that he kept it for many years in his barn. And where it is today, I have no idea. But that's another exciting clue that just slips through our fingers, that we wish we had more information.
That's crazy.
Let me turn on my light. I see I've gotten very dark in here. There, how's that?
There you go. That's a lot better.
That's a little better, isn't it?
Yeah.
I was counting on sunlight, and the sun went down on me. So it did make for a more mysterious mood or atmosphere around me.
Now, we have a couple questions. I don't know if you want to get into them yet or not.
Sure, go right ahead.
Well, Spiritual Odyssey asked earlier in the show about, when you're talking about the farmers around, was anybody actually investigated or arrested?
Evidently, yes, just before the crash, that there were spies and saboteurs, and that the FBI, according to newspaper articles, did make arrests in the weeks before the UFO crash, and that this was a real thing. There were some factories in Cape Girardeau and sabotage there, and they wondered who was doing this. Some of them were making boots or shoes that would have helped any potential war effort. To throw like a monkey wrench in the machinery would have been of mild assistance to the Nazis who didn't want America to be well outfitted. There were like machine parts being made. I bet that would be the more prime topic for or target for spies, but that arrests had been made and that the FBI was on the case before the crash happened.
And then Maggie, when you were talking about the guy with the brownie that took the one photo, do you think the original was destroyed? Because you said he gave them a copy, right? The other people.
Right. How many copies did he make from that negative? I don't know if it was destroyed after, but he said, I have a copy and I want you to have a copy. Well, that's 2 copies. And you can make as many as you want from a negative, especially if you hide it away in your own personal photo lab in your house, which he evidently, I think, had in the basement. He certainly worked in the basement of the local newspaper. There's even pictures of him developing film in this almost like basement warehouse type setting underneath the offices and the staff rooms for the newspaper reporters to put together the newspaper. So he could have hidden things there. He had a big estate sale of his property and his many of his photographs just before he passed away. And my dad went to that sale and he said, oh, if only I had known he might have had something like that, I would have taken a closer look at his pictures. I doubt if he would have had something like that in there. Not if he wanted to live, but it would have been something that you would have been told, you're not going to let this out. If you try doing something like this, we're going to have to, take action to stop you from making lots of copies and handing them out. It was risky. According to the minister's granddaughter, there was a feeling of real fear in Cape Girardeau in the weeks after the crash that people were being spied on or that you could get into trouble for talking about it because you had been warned very sternly and, sworn to secrecy. And so people were afraid. And here was this photographer showing up with this photograph. I don't think Reverend Huffman wanted it, but, he passed it along to his son who hid it away. And they held on to it for about a dozen years. Within the family only. The granddaughter says, I got to look at that photograph maybe up to a dozen times as a little girl. They would take it out at family parties and show it around. And as a little girl, he would get to glimpse it. And she said, again, it was just what her grandfather said, this bulbous-headed, weird-looking alien with big black eyes and crinkly skin. He would have been propped up on a kind of farm setting with a couple of trees in the background. So, again, that all hangs together.
So he never used his press camera, though. He just used the brownie?
Yeah, I think the big newspaper type speed graphic camera was either taken away or the film was yanked out of that. And they said, we'll take all that evidence now. Thank you. You're not going to be printing this anyway. We won't allow it. But I'm sure they took away his film. And that's why he managed to get away with this brownie thing, because he was so passionate about photography. He would carry the little brownie around all the time, and he had it in his pants pocket, and he stuck it back in there as the army arrived, and they never found out he had this little camera that had a little piece of evidence left over. And it would be so awesome if we could get someone to leak this, or if the government has it, someone within the government to leak it, or someone outside the government to leak a file and tell us, come clean. It's been 82 years. Don't we deserve the truth on this now? It's so frustrating. We're being treated like children, kept from the truth, like we can't handle it now. There's so much media saturation of alien things. on TV, in movies, magazines, newspapers, websites, people's home videos, that we're not going to panic or freak out if they were to come forward and say, yeah, we really were visited with a crash in 1941. That's a good place for them to start, I think.
Well, they're not going to come out and say, yeah, we lied to everybody for 80 some years.
Yeah, that's
they're
the
not
problem.
Going to come out and, yeah, they're not going to admit that.
You got to admit that they've been lying every decade. Oh, there's nothing to it. Don't listen to
right.
this. So they've kind of boxed themselves in a corner. And that's why it takes a whistleblower like David Grush to come forward and tell people, we've got this stuff. I've talked to lots of people who have seen all this stuff, either the actual crash disc or bodies, or they've seen the reports, they've seen like film footage or something. He said there was a variety of sources who told this to him over and over and over again. So we're being lied to. All I can say is that maybe the government has a few cases that were most unpleasant and would have been scary to the American public, possibly even to this day, and they feel it's best to just keep it covered up a little while longer. There's a man named, I think, John Ramirez, is that his name? Who came forward, said he'd been with the CIA, and it was his information that they're going to try to keep the lid on the UFO story for another 3 or 4 more years, till about the year 2027, when something is supposed to happen. He didn't say what it is, if he knows what it is that's going to happen, but the government's not ready to admit to anything. That's why you have not seen a lot of information come flooding out after David Grush. They'd want to keep the lid on for about, let's say, 4 more years. I don't know what's coming in 27 and how they know what's coming, whatever it is, unless they're planning maybe a big rollout of all their data. And at that time, they think we'll be firmed up emotionally, psychologically braced up by then. Who knows?
Yeah, I've heard 2027. I'm sorry, hon. I've heard 2027 a lot.
Yeah.
So, yeah, there's been several people talking about 2027.
Yeah. Scary? Do you find that intimidating or exciting?
I'm not sure.
Yeah. Oh,
why not now?
Yeah, what do they say? Or do they speculate what could be coming? Or they just have heard this too?
Yeah, there's just rumors that something's supposed to happen in 2027. Why not now? Why do we have to wait?
Yeah, why don't they come out right before your book at Christmas?
Yeah. It would be great for sales if somebody would leak something. Well, I don't know how to hack anything. I'm way too low tech. But some years ago, someone hacked into a government file and released this footage of an alien called Skinny Bob. Remember that?
Yeah.
And this bulbous-headed alien with big black eyes. And, he had all the features of the Mo 41 crash. And he moves. His eye kind of blinks. And there's like a pulsation in his head. And he steps and looks around. And it looks like the real deal. And supposedly he hacked a government file and released this onto the internet. And of course, though, that's a fake. Everyone who hates UFOs and aliens and doesn't want you to believe immediately jumps on this. Oh, well, I can debunk that. That's just a animated thing or something. I don't think so. I've read comments from people who said, I know CGI, computer generated imagery. That is not CGI. I can tell you that's probably the real deal, and it sure looks like it to me. By the way, that is of an alien that the Russians were in contact with. The backstory is that in 1942, 1 year after the Missouri crash, the KGB interrogated these alien creatures that sure sound like what crash landed on Missouri soil a year before. True or not, that's the story.
Now, fascinating. Was there ever any reports of anybody actually seeing the UFO come across the sky before it crashed?
Oh, yeah. Good question.
One man and his apparent girlfriend, maybe turned wife, told a guy who told me that he saw it land and crash and turn into a fireball, and that he went racing into the farmhouse to call the fire department because he thought, oh, my God, there's been an airplane crash and might set the whole farm on fire. So the Cape Girardeau Fire Department was shared the same building with the Cape Girardeau Police Department. And that's how, again, they could have all gotten together and converged very quickly on a sleepy, let's say, Thursday night. There wouldn't have been anything else to do. So hearing about an airplane crash might have been even all hands on deck. This is a serious emergency. This guy phoned it in. In those days, you had to go to an operator and you couldn't direct dial. But
Yeah.
that's the story. And I did some more research on this man, and his wife, his widow, is still alive and about 95. And all my attempts to reach her have not succeeded. She's either evading talking about it, or it's possible she has moved to a kind of nursing home where they won't tell you any information now. It's illegal to give out information on, your patients. They're very, very tight with this kind of data that they won't tell perfect strangers. And that's understandable unless you're a member of the family. So it's so frustrating. And at 95, what does she remember? Is she in her right mind?
Right.
Another exciting clue that kind of falls apart.
Did you ever contact any of the families from the fire department members that were there at the scene?
I have not, and I would like to hear more about this Walter Reynolds, who passed away, obviously, and his grandson told this story, and he seems to have kind of disappeared. I would like to see him contact me or somebody, but if there were others, they were probably sworn to secrecy and took it maybe to their graves. Now, I talked to a man who said, my father-in-law worked on the trains in the Cape Girardeau area. And he knew the Cape Girardeau Fire Department chief Lewis was his name. And he said, my father-in-law and Chief Lewis would talk about this alien crash. And the guy said, my boss says, talking to Chief Lewis about this, he said, I'll never forget his description of the bodies they found. He said, it made my skin crawl. It was so creepy, and I'll never forget it. So that's like a secondhand story of a man who worked with his father-in-law. I said it was his father-in-law was a really good man who would never tell kind of weird, wild stories. He did not seek attention, but the father-in-law knew the chief of the fire department. And again, this was a real alien event, not a joke, not a plane crash. And it should be more famous than it is before Roswell, which gets all the attention.
Did any of the witnesses say they smelled anything when they were near the bodies?
That's a good question. I'd never read anything or heard anything about an odor. I don't think the bodies had been. Wait a minute. There was a story Linda Wallace uncovered that there was a stench. Come to think of it, I think by the next day that the bodies may have been starting to decay or something at the site was getting smelly, and that the man who had started with the muscles, who was starting to lift the disc up, had his hands on it, that he couldn't wash the stench off his hands for days, that his hands, he kept washing them over and over and over. I don't know why the craft itself would be smelly unless they had body parts, cow parts. It was dairy country. We've heard so many stories of cattle mutilations over the years that that could have been the intent, and that the aliens were the ones who ended up dead on the ground instead of cattle with their organs surgically removed. How ironic would that have been? So maybe if the ship itself held some organs or some dead bodies that they had been examining, that might have accounted for a nasty smell. So good question.
Well, I've heard several reports on, other shows and stuff throughout all these years that they don't have a body part to go to the bathroom, so it comes out of their pores and they smell kind of like urine.
Yeah, I've read that too. I think Colonel Philip Corso said something like that for the day after Roswell. And he said that the Army intelligence, with the work of scientists, came to the conclusion that the Roswell crash victims, who were so much like the Cape Girardeau crash victims, were so-called biorobots, that they weren't quite like you and I, actual complete biological entities, that they were like cloned in a lab by a higher intelligence, programmed to do the dirty work, and that's why they were all identical. That's what Reverend Huffman said. They were all look alike, the three of them, like they'd been punched out of a mold. And so that makes sense why the alien overlords, if you want to call them that, didn't come back for the bodies. Why bother? We can go back to the lab and get some undamaged ones and just replace them, and it doesn't mean anything for them. So that was another factor, I'm sure, in why we were allowed to keep them, because, it was a little over our heads then. We began to figure it out in the years after, cloning, creating creatures that are intelligently programmed, artificial intelligence. We're really getting into that now. So again, the story kind of hangs together. It seems to fit.
Yeah. They're like little alien robots.
Right, that they didn't
they can
have
just clone.
sexuality or sexual organs.
Yeah.
And that whatever they consumed to keep them alive, they would secrete as like a kind of perspiration within those tight-fitting suits.
Right.
Now, Spiritual Odyssey, and I think this was during the congressional hearing, that there was somebody said something about a J-rod, and they worked very closely with it while all this was going on.
Yeah, I heard that about another crash. I don't think that's Cape Girardeau. I don't think 1941 had any survivors other than that the three that were dead on the ground in front of the minister, the third one barely alive, and then he died immediately. I don't think J-Rod had anything to do with that. It might have been a crash from the American Southwest. And there are rumors that one or two were taken to Los Alamos National Laboratories in New Mexico, which would have been a short, logical trip for any Roswell crash or Aztec, New Mexico in 1948.
Yeah.
Then Maggie was asking if there was any reports of we asked about bacteria, but any radiation sickness.
Yeah, I think it's a very legitimate question, but I haven't seen anything. I have not read anything like that. I'll throw in real quick that one man contacted me and assured me there was a second crash that night.
Oh.
And that there was material that came down in someone's yard about a mile from the main crash. And that the person who owned it was a wealthy person. And I went to that property, and it's all no trespassing, keep out, private property. So I can't go and talk to them. And then they moved away. They sold the house and moved away. It was from a prominent Cape Girardeau family that was involved in politics. They were very conservative, and I can see why they would have kept the lid on the story. But at one point I searched, and the man who survived into the 2000s once wrote online of the Cape Girardeau crash, yeah, some of it came down to my parents' yard. And I thought, wow. That's interesting. Now, Linda Moulton Howe was telling me about this second crash from Roswell, and that they estimate, the government did in a report that got leaked, that the second crash may have been an escape pod, that while the main craft was coming down, it ejected something. And I'm thinking that could well be the Cape Girardeau affair right there in a nutshell, that something smaller came down, ejected an escape pod. Whether there was anyone in it or not, I don't know. It could have been empty. It could have been automatically ejected, as they were damaged. So in Roswell, that could have been the case, and in Cape Girardeau. So radiation sickness, I'm not aware of any, but you would think somebody who was touching all of this stuff did have some like rotted skin or some burns or got ill, but it was not well reported.
Now, Noah wants to know if there's any reports of crop circles in the area. Did any other races come back and maybe leave a crop circle in the area?
It's a good question. I don't know of any. We have plenty of crops. And Linda Wallace, the author, who covered this story more from the Sykeston angle, 30 miles south of Cape, said she recorded a number of sources who told her daylight discs, orbs, UFOs over countryside farms and such in southeast Missouri in the Sykeston area over the years. It wasn't uncommon for people to see these weird things that defied our laws of gravity in the days long before drones, even blimps, helicopters back in the 30s and 40s. And so I did get some of that information too from people who contacted me in the general area of the crash that we would see some pretty weird things. One woman told me, I live about like 7 or 8 miles from Cape Girardeau out in farm country. And one night we saw this white light in the sky, and it hovered over what appears to be the general area of the crash. And then it took off towards the airport. And this was like in 2010, like, did they send some sort of probe or a disc back, to study the crash site from 41?
Yeah.
She said it definitely was not a plane or a helicopter. It was this silent, like orb of light, and it was hovering around, and then it floated off out of their sight. So it's just another piece of the mystery. Another person wrote and said, I've got a friend from that area, and he is a Christian minister, and he said he had this terrible, like, psychic experience that drained his energy when he got close to that farm area. I don't know how to quite put it. I got it in my book as he described it, and this was like maybe 10, 20 years ago. So I don't know what to tell you there either. Just very strange, yeah.
So when you said there was another crash or another, debris, my mind went to like the things people talk online about. Maybe there's a space war or a galactic battle up there, and these guys crashed from that. Maybe there was more than one crash.
We don't know what caused the crash. It could have been an attack by a different alien race. Could have been mechanical error, pilot error, weather related. We think of aliens, well, they just must be perfect, but no, they're fallible beings who are not familiar with our gravitational and electromagnetic forces. They are not familiar with wind gusts and lightning and our thunderstorms. They're not familiar with piloting over strange lands like Missouri in the dark. So there's all kinds of reasons. Also, World War II was raging in Europe. You could have been hit by, let's say, an aerial bombardment and then managed to stagger halfway across the globe before your ship crash landed, that it took some damage and it took a while. There's just all kinds of reasons why a disk could have crashed and did. I wish we had more answers, but someone asked General George Marshall, who worked for FDR, about UFOs. The scientist said, I asked him, and he said, well, we've had 3 crashes. He said this as of like 1950, 52, and said that in each case, bodies were recovered and they were incinerated from within because they could not breathe our atmosphere, and that they looked fine on the outside. And this is exactly what Reverend Huffman said he saw. He said, I saw these 3 bodies. They didn't have any visible injuries. What killed them? And so they were quite dead, and that one was having trouble breathing, and it all fits together. They couldn't breathe our oxygen-rich atmosphere. They were used to the close confines within their spaceship. Once it cracked open, they couldn't breathe, and they died.
Yeah.
Wow.
And their organs just incinerated from the different kind of air around us. They couldn't handle it. So it's fascinating. It's so exciting to know these things allegedly happened. I think it really did happen. To piece it all together is exciting. Can't get Hollywood's interest. And you know who used to live right near not far from the crash site? Kate Capshaw, the famous movie actress, married to Steven Spielberg, and they used to come into the Cape Girardeau airport to go pick up her daughter from a previous relationship who grew up in the area.
Wow.
He lived like 10 miles from Kate Capshaw in the old days before she became famous. And so you got to wonder, did Capshaw and Spielberg know about the Cape Girardeau, or was it a pure coincidence that crash could have happened and they were in and out of town, not far from the site? And he's all about UFOs and aliens. And there's a new series out called Encounters. I think it's on Netflix, about people's sightings of UFOs. So he's still passionate about the subject. And I'd love to get him a copy of my book and let him turn it into a movie, a streaming show, a TV documentary, whatever he wants to do. But my agent's having some problems breaking through in that area. But we do have another project going on that might lead to success where I could push the Cape Girardeau story on a grand level. So we've got to get, I've got to get my foot in the door first. We'll see what happens.
Well, to sign a book and send it to them.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if Close Encounters and ET was kind of spurred by Cape Girardeau.
Could be. I've read that like 30 years ago, one or two people in Hollywood received books and read them, and then they went on to appear in like a TV show or a movie that kind of showed what happened in the books or something. And they got sued real fast. You stole my work. I sent you my book. So now, to avoid that, they'll send the book back. They don't want to read it. They don't want to touch it. No one wants to be sued. So I can't send a book, to Steven Spielberg. They would not touch such a thing. It has to be forwarded by an agent to another agent to a producer, someone who would check it out first. And you have to have connections. And so it's tough. And the Writers Guild, Actors Guild strike didn't help matters either. Now projects are all bottled up, and it'll take a while to get things expanded and buy new projects.
Now, Derek's talking about your Jackie Gleason story.
Yeah.
I think we'll have you back on, and we'll dig into the Jackie Gleason and we'll have a Nixon connection.
Oh, that's an exciting story. It's a great story because Jackie was a great entertainer. They called him the Great One. And he and Nixon were close pals. There's plenty of photographs of the two of them together. And Nixon allegedly showed him the goods.
Wow.
And, this is something that Jackie would not talk to the press about. He refused to comment one way or the other. And he could easily dismiss the story and say, well, that's nonsense. But he didn't. He kept his mouth shut. And supposedly, according to biographers, some close friends he trusted with the truth. And he told them, I know we're being visited. Nixon showed me the proof. And that's all he would say. Nixon showed me the proof in private. And in public, he wouldn't say anything. So it's a great story there.
Yeah.
I'm hoping my agent and I to get that into the right hands of Hollywood people. We'll see how that takes place, but we'll save that for another show.
Yeah, we'll have you back on. We'll talk about that connection and Jackie and Nixon. And
yeah, I forgot about that. You got a good story and details about all that. That would definitely be a part 2.
And we'll do it one of these days, Alice. One of these days. It's Sunday night. The Honeymooners will be on at 11 o'clock. I usually tune in, even though I've seen them all before, if I can stay awake.
Yeah,
that's right, Ralph. You're going to watch The Honeymooners, but you gotta let me watch The Honeymooners, Alice. Well, anyway, it's still a funny show, and it's held up well. Jackie was an amazingly talented, intelligent man, obsessed with UFOs. He had over 1,700 books and periodicals on the paranormal, heavy on UFOs. He would have been a great guest for your show, or he would have watched your podcast.
I would like to think so. That would be awesome. I love The Honeymooners.
He would call in a paranormal radio show in New York City, and it would be on at midnight, the Long John Nebel show. And he said, this is Jackie Gleason. I want to talk about this UFO sighting this man had. And he would talk about this on the air. I listened to some of the recordings of this. The audio is terrible, but it is Jackie, and he does describe some things. And he didn't believe everything he heard. He was not a fool. And so he was quite into it like no one else, and at the risk of his career, because he didn't want to be thought of as a nut, but he went overboard on the subject. God bless him. We're glad that he did.
Yeah.
Well, I think we'll end this here and give you a chance to tell everybody where they can find your books. And if you want to give out your email, if anybody just happens to have a nugget to share with you. And
right. If you're on Facebook, I'm on there in a couple different pages. Look up Cape Girardeau's 1941 UFO crash, or my own author's page. I've got an Instagram account. I've got a Twitter account. I've got a Pinterest account, LinkedIn. I've tried to get this out. You can contact me in that manner. You can write to my publishers, and you can buy lots and lots of books and send them to your friends for Christmas. You can find them on Amazon, certainly. My latest book that I hope will come out that, oh, there it is, should be out this fall. Look for it as the months go by. And unless something's gone wrong with my publisher, it's called Mo 41, Your Complete Guide to the Missouri 1941 UFO Crash with some new data. That's from Argus Books, where shipping is free. So I sure thank you for having me on and letting me talk about where you can get my materials. Amazon's always a good source. And I always appreciate talking to intelligent, informed people who are open-minded, not disrespectful or snide or sarcastic. So I enjoyed being on your show, and we'll have to set up another one to talk about Ralph Cramden and his good buddy, the President of the United States, and what they saw one night in 1973.
Yep, that would be awesome.
That'd be awesome. Be about the beginning of the year. We're pretty much booked all the way through the end of the year already.
Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, beginning of the year, we'll try to get you scheduled on when you're available, and we'll do a part 2.
Then hopefully your book will be out. And
yeah.
Well, hopefully.
The book would be out.
Cross my fingers. Hopefully, it's a little dicey right now, but if folks will keep trying Amazon and Argus, argusbooks.com, look for it there.
All right. Well, don't go anywhere. We're just going to say goodbye and good night to everybody, and then we'll talk to you right after the show. Well, thanks everybody for coming on, and this has been a great show. I mean, this is so interesting about Cape Girardeau and the UFO crash, and we've actually drove by Cape Girardeau and we never knew anything about it.
Right. So look for Paul's book and make sure you buy it, and be excellent Christmas gifts if they can get it out by Christmas. Otherwise, you'll just have to give them out for birthday presents, I guess.
Any excuse.
Yeah.
Just buy it,
Valentine's Day
out, and share this program out to anybody or any groups that you have to get Paul's story and his book out there. And we appreciate it very much. Hit the like button, share, hit that notification bell,
subscribe.
And we love you all, and we'll just say good night at that.
Love you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.